"Sir, this floor is restricted. You'll need to go back downstairs." The words came out, clipped, precise, the kind of tone that had been practiced over years of deciding who belonged and who didn't. Alistair Bowen didn't move right away. He stood, just inside the elevator doors, holding a manila folder against his coat, and looked at the woman behind the reception desk the way a man looks at something mildly puzzling, not with anger, not with hurt, just with the quiet patience of someone who has heard this particular sentence before. "I have an appointment," he said. "I don't see anything in the system. With Mr. Fournier. 11 o'clock. The woman, her nameplate read Diane Colbert, Senior Client Relations, tilted her chin up and looked at him the way people sometimes look at a stain on the carpet. He was wearing a gray wool coat that had seen better winters. His shoes were sensible but unremarkable. He was a black man somewhere in his late 50s, broad through the shoulders, hair going silver at the temples, and he had taken the elevator to the 14th floor of Meridian Trust's downtown Toronto office on a Tuesday morning in February, with a manila folder and an appointment that, according to Diane Colbert, did not exist. "Our private client floor is invitation only," she said. "Perhaps you'd like me to call someone from the main branch downstairs? They'd be happy to assist you." Alistair looked at her for a moment. "I'd like you to call Mr. Fournier's office. Mr. Fournier is in meetings. Then I'll wait." Diane Colbert made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She glanced sideways at the young man standing near the door. A security consultant named Wade Ellery, whose actual job was to stand near the door and look as though he was doing something. Wade Ellery straightened slightly. "Sir," Diane said, and the word had an edge to it now, something just barely polite. "I'm going to have to ask you to take the elevator back to the main floor. If you genuinely have business with one of our private clients, they can submit the proper." "Diane." The voice came from the corridor to the left, calm and unhurried. A woman in her early 40s appeared at the edge of the reception area. Tall, natural hair pinned back, a dark blazer, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. This was Simone Achebe, one of the firm's junior legal associates, and she had been on her way back from the document room when she heard the exchange. She stopped when she saw Alistair. She did not move for a moment. "Is everything all right?" she asked, and she was directing the question at Alistair, not Diane. "Apparently I'm on the wrong floor," he said, with something that wasn't quite a smile. Simone looked at Diane Colbert. Then she looked at the folder in Alistair's hand and at the small embossed symbol on its cover, a falcon in a circle, and something shifted behind her eyes. "He's fine where he is," Simone said. Diane turned to her. "Simone, I don't think he's fine where he is." There was a silence on the 14th floor of Meridian Trust that lasted about 4 seconds. It felt longer. Let's go back to the beginning. Because Alistair Bowen's story doesn't start on that Tuesday morning in February. It starts, really, on a farm in Nova Scotia in 1967, which is where his grandmother, a woman named Hattie Bowen, made a decision that would take 57 years to fully land. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Alistair grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, the youngest of 4 children. His father, Vincent, drove trucks. His mother, Loretta, worked at a dry cleaning business on Cannon Street for 23 years. They were not wealthy people. They were not people who talked much about money, actually. They talked about work, and about church, and about whether the tickets were going to have a decent season. And occasionally, when the bills were tight, they didn't talk about much at all. What Alistair learned, growing up, was that the world had a way of sorting people into categories before they'd opened their mouths, and that the most effective response to that sorting was not to argue with it directly, but to simply outlast it. His father told him this once, sitting on the back steps of the house on Wentworth Street. "You don't have to convince everyone," Vincent said. "You just have to be around long enough for the truth to show itself." Alistair took that advice somewhere deep inside himself and kept it there. He was not a flashy man. That's important to understand. He drove a 10-year-old Buick, not because he couldn't afford a newer car, but because the Buick ran fine, and he didn't see the point. He bought his coats at a shop on James Street North, where the owner knew his name and gave him a fair price. He ate at the same diner on King Street every Friday morning. Eggs, whole wheat toast, black coffee, and had done so for the better part of 2 decades. The staff there called him Mr. B and refilled his cup without being asked. He had built 2 things over the course of his working life: a commercial property management company that now oversaw roughly 40 buildings across southern Ontario, and a real estate investment portfolio that, if you added it up carefully, was worth somewhere north of $60 million. He did not talk about this at diners. He had learned, over time, that talking about money rarely made anything better, and sometimes made things considerably worse. The money existed. It worked. That was enough. The first time he walked into Meridian Trust's private client division, 6 years earlier, the advisor who met him, a patient, careful man named Gerald Whitby, had spent the first 10 minutes of their meeting gently trying to establish whether Alistair might be in the wrong place. Not rudely, not with any malice that Alistair could identify, but with a particular kind of delicacy that only comes from not quite believing what you're seeing. Alistair had sat across from Gerald and answered every question with the same unhurried certainty, and by the end of the hour, Gerald Whitby had been converted into one of the most attentive financial advisors Alistair had ever had. Gerald retired 2 years ago. He sent a Christmas card every year. The appointment on this particular Tuesday was with Marcus Fournier, who had taken over Gerald's accounts and was, by most measures, competent but not especially imaginative. The appointment was about a property acquisition in Brampton, a mixed-use development that Alistair was considering as part of a larger restructuring of his portfolio. The manila folder contained a preliminary assessment and some numbers that needed looking at. None of this was visible from the elevator. What Diane Colbert saw when the doors opened was a man in a gray coat who did not look like her idea of someone who belonged on the 14th floor. She would not have put it that way, of course. She would have said she was simply following protocol. Private Client Services had a list. You checked the list. You verified appointments. You maintained a standard of, and here was her word for it, exclusivity that the clients who paid for this floor had been promised. She had worked at Meridian Trust for 11 years. She had been good at this job, or at least she had believed herself to be. She ran a tight desk. She remembered names. She was precise about appointments, and meticulous about the kind of quiet authority that reception desks on private banking floors are meant to project. She was not, as she would have told you herself, a prejudiced person. But here is what happened in the 7 seconds between the elevator doors opening and Alistair saying he had an appointment. Diane Colbert looked at him, and something in her assessment of who belonged on this floor and who did not completed itself before a single word had been spoken. This is the thing that most people don't talk about honestly. Not the dramatic moments, not the slurs, not the obvious performances of hostility, but the quiet automatic sorting that happens in that first 7 seconds, the one that shapes every interaction that follows. Alistair knew this about 7-second assessments. He had been on the receiving end of them enough times to recognize the moment it happened. He watched it move across Diane Colbert's face like a weather front crossing a lake. He did not say anything about it. He simply told her he had an appointment. When she said she didn't see it in the system, he was not surprised. When she suggested the main floor downstairs, he was not surprised. When Wade Ellery near the door straightened his shoulders, he was not surprised. He had, over 57 years, become very difficult to surprise. Simona Chi was 28 months into her position at Meridian Trust's legal department, which meant she had learned enough to know when something was wrong, and not quite enough seniority to be certain she could say so. She had grown up in Brampton, the daughter of a nurse and an electrical engineer, and she had graduated near the top of her class at Osgoode and done a year articling in Ottawa before coming to Toronto. She was the kind of young woman who noticed things. She noticed the folder in Alistair's hand, not because she had been briefed, but because she had, 6 weeks earlier, been part of a document review for a very large commercial file, an acquisition of a mixed-use property portfolio in the Western GTA, and the embossed symbol on the cover of that folder, a falcon in a circle, was the symbol of Bowen Property Group. She had seen that symbol on approximately 300 pages of legal documents over 2 days in a boardroom on the 12th floor. She knew exactly who Alistair Bowen was. And so when she said, with the flat, steady calm of someone who has decided something, "He's fine where he is," she was not improvising. She was making a choice she had been preparing for without knowing it. Diane Colbert stared at her. "He doesn't have a confirmation," Diane said, lower now, as though Alistair weren't standing 4 feet away. "Marcus Fournier's 11 o'clock is Mr. Bowen," Simone said. "I suggest you call upstairs. I don't need you to tell me how to, Diane." And Simone's voice, this time, was not the voice of a junior associate who was working out whether she had the standing to speak. It was something else entirely. Something older and more resolved. "Call upstairs." Diane Colbert held the look for a moment longer. Then she picked up the phone. Marcus Fournier came down from the senior advisor suite in less time than it should have taken, which suggested he had already been wondering where Alistair was. He was a compact man in his mid-40s, with a particular kind of social smoothness that comes from spending a career in wealth management. Always calm, always amenable, always wearing the right expression for the room. He came around the corner and stopped when he saw the configuration. Alistair near the elevator, Simone standing several feet away with her arms crossed, Diane Colbert behind her desk holding a phone she had apparently just put down. "Alistair," Marcus said, and crossed the room to him with his hand out. "I am so sorry. I don't know what happened with the system. We had a whole IT thing this morning. It's been a mess." He shook Alistair's hand warmly, the way you shake the hand of someone whose business you very much want to keep. "Come on up. Can I get you a coffee? We've got the new Rwandan single origin. It's exceptional." Alistair looked at him. Then he glanced back, briefly, at Diane Colbert, who was now studying something on her monitor with focused attention. "Sure," he said. "Coffee sounds good." The meeting itself lasted an hour and 40 minutes. Marcus had prepared well. Charts, projections, comparative analyses on the Brampton acquisition, and the conversation was professional and substantive, and moved at the pace of a discussion between people who both understood what they were talking about. At one point toward the end, Marcus leaned back in his chair and said, with the practiced casualness of a man raising something he'd been meaning to raise, "I hope the experience downstairs didn't. I heard there was some kind of mix-up with the front desk. I want you to know that's absolutely not." "I know," Alistair said. "We take that very seriously. I know you do." Marcus nodded, relieved. He was the kind of man who was relieved by the absence of a scene. Alistair noted this about him with neither contempt nor particular sympathy. Marcus was good at his job. That was sufficient. What Marcus did not know, what he would not learn until the following Thursday, when it arrived in the form of a formal letter from Alistair's legal counsel, was that Alistair had already been considering something well beyond the Brampton property. He had been quietly evaluating, for the better part of 8 months, a substantial equity stake in Meridian Trust's parent holding company. The numbers were large, the kind of large that changed the composition of a board. This was not, as it happened, connected to what had occurred downstairs. Alistair was not the kind of man who made multi-million-dollar financial decisions out of spite. That was not the kind of leverage that interested him. But it would, in the months that followed, give him a level of visibility within the institution that made certain things very difficult to ignore. Simone Achebe was at her desk on the 12th floor that afternoon, working through a contract review, when she got a message from her supervisor asking her to come upstairs. She went upstairs expecting to be told with various degrees of professional delicacy that what had happened at the front desk was not her business, and that junior associates should not insert themselves into situations that did not concern them. Instead, she found herself sitting across from the head of legal, a careful woman named Patricia Vogt, who asked her to describe exactly what she had witnessed. Simone described it. Patricia Vogt listened without interruption, made a few notes, and then said, in the tone of someone closing a door, gently but firmly, "Thank you, Simone. You did the right thing." Simone went back downstairs. She did not know at that point what would follow. She was not naive enough to assume that doing the right thing always produced the right outcomes. But she had done it, and she had to trust that it would land somewhere. 3 days later, Diane Colbert was called into a meeting with Human Resources and a senior member of the compliance team. Meridian Trust had, in recent years, developed a fairly robust set of internal policies around equitable client treatment, partly because the regulatory environment demanded it, partly because the bank had made public commitments that needed to be reflected in documented behavior, and partly because there were now partners and shareholders who noticed when gaps appeared between public commitments and internal practice. The meeting was private. Simone never learned the exact details of what was said. What she did learn, from the quiet, reliable network of information that flows through any large office, was that Diane Colbert had been placed on a formal performance improvement plan, that Wade Ellery had received a documented warning, and that the private client services reception team had been enrolled in mandatory training that had apparently been sitting in a queue for 2 years without implementation. None of this was announced. It wasn't the kind of thing that got an email. A month after the incident, Alistair was back on the 14th floor for a follow-up meeting. The person at the reception desk this time was a young man named Kofi, last name Alistair didn't catch, who stood when he came off the elevator and said, pleasantly and without any hesitation, "Mr. Bowen? Mr. Fournier is expecting you. I'll let him know you're here." That was it. That was the whole thing. Alistair said thank you, and sat down in one of the chairs by the window. He could see the lake from here, gray and wide in the March light, the CN Tower off to the south. He sat with his folder on his knee and his coffee order already on its way and thought, for a moment, about his father sitting on those back steps in Hamilton, telling him that the truth had a way of showing itself if you were around long enough to let it. He had been around. He thought about his grandmother, Hattie, in Nova Scotia. The decision she had made in 1967 that had sent a small ripple forward through time. She had bought land, back then, in a county where black families did not typically buy land, from a man who hadn't expected to sell it to her, and she had held on to it for 30 years, through everything that holding on to things requires. And when she died, she left it to her children, who sold parts of it and held on to other parts. And one of those parts eventually came to Alistair, who was 22 and didn't know what he had, and who found out slowly over the next decade, as the city grew toward it, that what he had was the foundation of everything that came after. He never talked about this at dinners. The money existed. It worked. That was enough. Simone was getting coffee in the 12th floor kitchen one morning in April when she heard the news. Not officially, not formally, but in the way that significant things travel through office buildings, that Bowen Property Group had completed a substantial acquisition of equity in Meridian Trust's parent company. This was not secret information. It would be filed publicly in due course and noted in the relevant financial disclosures. What people were talking about, in the quiet corners and over lunch, was less the financial detail and more the implication of it. There was a new name on certain documents that hadn't been there before. Simone heard this and poured her coffee and went back to her desk and sat down and did not say anything about what she knew or what she had witnessed or what any of it might or might not have meant. She was not the kind of person who needed to say things out loud to understand them. Alistair, for his part, continued to drive the Buick. He went to the diner on King Street on Friday mornings. He ate eggs and whole wheat toast and drank black coffee, and the staff called him Mr. B, and refilled his cup without being asked, and he read the paper and thought about what needed doing next week. He had a call scheduled with a lawyer about a property in Mississauga. He had a site visit in Brampton on Wednesday. His daughter, who lived in Vancouver, was coming home for Easter, and he was planning to make the jerk chicken she always asked for, which took 2 days if you did it properly, and he intended to do it properly. He was not thinking particularly about the 14th floor of Meridian Trust, or about Diane Colbert, or about the 7 seconds that had passed between the elevator doors opening and the word appointment. He had thought about it in the way you think about things that are familiar in their shape. He had placed it alongside the other accumulated incidents of 57 years. The ones that made you tired, the ones that made you precise, the ones that in their total weight explain certain things about how a man learns to carry himself in the world. He had placed it there and moved on, because that is what you do when you have been around long enough to know that staying stopped is the one thing you cannot afford. There is something worth saying about Simone Achebe before this ends. She has been asked since whether she did what she did because she knew who Alistair was, because she had seen the falcon on the folder, because she understood the commercial weight of what was in that manila envelope. It's a fair question. It's the kind of question that goes to the heart of why anyone does the right thing. She has answered it the same way each time. She did not know, she says, when she heard Diane Colbert's voice and came around the corner, exactly what she was going to do. She knew what she was looking at. She had grown up in Brampton. She had sat across from her own version of that 7-second assessment at enough tables and in enough offices to understand its texture precisely. She saw it in Diane Colbert's posture, in the angle of Wade Ellery's shoulder, in the particular quality of the air in the room. She says she would have done the same thing if the folder had been empty. She would like to believe that. Most days she does believe it. And if you've ever been standing in a hallway, hearing something in the next room that you know is wrong, knowing that walking toward it instead of away from it will cost you something. Maybe something small, maybe something significant. Then you know exactly what kind of courage she is describing. It isn't the dramatic kind. It isn't the kind that gets filmed or applauded. It's the quiet, inconvenient, ordinary kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just shows up.